All right, Jude, you are all set.
Excellent, thank you. Hello, everyone. Greetings, greetings. My name is Judith Sidney. Good evening. I am thrilled to be here with all of you. I am a alumni of GAN. As you can see, my son graduated in 2020, and I am one of the co-founders of Tribe Talk. Along with the educators and staff at GAN Academy and my colleagues, Michelle Black and Robin Friedman, we want to thank you for joining us and welcome you to our inaugural session of the Israel 101 program for alumni parents, students, grandparents, and current parents at GAN Academy. Before we get into the substance of our program, we wanted to share a few details of the origin of this program series and the collaborators. Both GAN and Tribe Talk, a nonprofit founded to empower young people to navigate the complexities of Jewish life, were approached to co-host this series. The informative program series has been made possible through the incredible generosity and loving memory of Walter and Naomi Chuchnin by the Hartman, Kablotsky, and Ente families. We are so very grateful for their vision and partnership. The intent was to make this series accessible to all who want to participate and to expand the reach of the curriculum and content with those that might have missed the opportunity while studying at GAN. The session format, both Jonathan and Yoni will facilitate these sessions and will share informative information during the presentations. I am thrilled to introduce you to two GAN All-Stars from the History Department, Dr. Jonathan Golden and Yoni Cadden. Together, they bring over 30 years, but I think that's actually more, of teaching at GAN Academy into this incredible Zoom room. And though need no formal introduction, I would be remiss if I didn't direct you to GAN's website to learn more about their work in recent years. The goal is to get the Jewish community to be engaged with Israel, talking about Israel, understanding the complexities, and deepening our connection to the land and to each other. A couple of housekeeping before I turn the Zoom room over to Yoni and Jonathan. Please mute yourselves, turn on your speaker, be on speaker mode, and please keep your screens on. We want to see your beautiful faces. Feel free to put any questions into the chat as we will be monitoring them during the evening. And Yoni and Jonathan do like to pause during their presentation to answer questions. Please note, we will be recording this evening. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the Zoom over to Jonathan and Yoni.
Great, Jude. Thank you. And thank you to Tribe Talk. Thank you to the supporters of this program. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Yoni and I are excited to be here to be teaching this class, which was made possible through a partnership with the community. It's hard to believe it's 6 years already that we've been teaching versions of this class. And we're really excited. That's another opportunity for the broader GAN community to be together. Hopefully you have access to the PowerPoint slides we're going to share tonight. We've shared them in the chat before. Maybe let's put them in one more time, Yoni, just in case you're just joining us and want to access them. But we'll be going through them tonight, and what we want you to have access to the slides so that you can see them along the way. You may want to review them after we have the session tonight. So there's a live link to the Google Drive, which will access those slides that we'll be going through tonight. And so what we'll do next is like to frame how we'll spend our 4 sessions together and some of the questions we're going to pose. But as you mentioned, we're really excited for your questions too. So we will stop from time to time for opportunity for questions and for a bit of conversation. The chat is there for you to pose those questions as you think of them. Also, you can use the hand raise function in Zoom, and you're welcome to ask those questions as well. So let's begin with Class 1 Hatikva. And as our first slide, we'd like to show you the 4 session overview, titles and ways we're thinking about our 4 sessions together. And this class, again, was designed based upon people in the community and the questions that they asked us 6 years ago. And we've taken those questions that continue to both be the same, but of course evolve over the 6 years. And that's how the course that you see this evening for the next 3 nights was created. Class 1 is Hatikva, the Hope, the name of Israel's national anthem. And we'll talk about the hope that begins with Zionism and goes into the pre-state period. Class 2 is Hamatzav, the situation, looking at the key years of 1948 and 1967, Israel's independence war, the Six-Day War, and how they led to the situation, the conflicts. Hamatzav is the term often referred to that. We'll unpack some of the context to understand that moment and how it applies to today. Class 3, Hayom and Atid, really focused both on today and the future, And notice we talk about the future going all the way back to 1973, really how the past half century of life in Israel continues to shape our world. And in class 4, it's time for the contemporary conversation, to take all the history, the learning, the rhymes as we'll talk about them, and to see how they apply to our own world today. So that's the overview of our time together. What's always important for Yoni and me is that we'd like to get a sense of who's with us in the learning conversation. So we always like to start with this course with this question. And in a moment, we'll ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves, because we're going to be learning together for the next 4 sessions. And the question is as follows. When I think of Israel, we want you to share the first word or short phrase that comes to mind. When I think of Israel, the first word or short phrase that comes to mind. So at this time, I'm wondering, is it possible we could go back to the gallery view? Because I think this will be easiest perhaps if we'll call on folks. Is that possible for Seth or Jude to do? That would be great. Okay, excellent. So what I'm going to do now is I'll briefly call on you and just there's a chance you can unmute, so we'll have to hear everyone's voice. And just to share out, name, briefly your GAN connection, and when you think of Israel, the first word or phrase that comes to mind. And so I'm going to use the names that I see there. I see there are some couples as well, so I'll see what I have on my Zoom screen. So we're going to start with Carol Harris, followed by Nancy, and then Debbie and Jonathan Foreman in that order. So Carol first, please, Robert.
Carol? Hi, I'm Carol Harris. Hi, Jonathan. So we had 2 graduates from GAN, Eve Khan and Sam Khan. I was also on the board at GAN. The first word, I think about a lot of things, but I think of Israel as prosperity.
I'll go with Jewish homeland. That's my contribution.
Great, thank you. Nancy, please.
Hi, I have 3 GAN graduates. The last was around 6 or 7 years ago, and they're all doing great. You didn't ask what I think about when I think of GAN, and the answer is Jonathan and Yoni. But beyond that, when I think of Israel, I think of the old city.
Thank you. Debbie and Jonathan, please.
Hi, I'm Debbie Foreman, and we have 3 GAN graduates. Daniel 2001, Leah 2004, and Naomi 2007. And when I think of Israel, I think also Jewish homeland.
And I'm Jonathan, and I think of Israel, I think my Jewish country.
Thank you. And as we're hearing these answers, notice both the patterns and what's different, and we'll talk about that a bit as we go to the next section. So for the next 3, Helene, Hartman, Jude, and then Alan and Leslie. So Helene first, please.
Okay, I'm Helene Hartman. I have 2 GAN graduates. That's not easy to say. Noah and Jonah Ente. And when I think of Israel, I think of our Jewish history and a homeland.
Hi, everyone. Jude Sidney, Jude. When I have Ari who graduated in 2020. When I think of Israel, I think of Startup Nation and the hope of the Jewish people.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Alan Sherman. I'm here with my wife, Leslie. We're the parents of 2 GAN alumni, Zachary from the class of 2019 and Josh from the class of 2021. We have 2 different answers on this. So I'll say for myself, when I think of Israel, the first word that comes to my mind is complexity.
And I thought of Jewish homeland, which others have said already.
Great, thank you. For the next 3, Elisa, Michelle Wolfman, and Frank. So Elisa first, please.
Hi, my sons Noah and Jonah are alumni. When I think of Israel, I think of covenant on the one hand and innovation on the other.
Hi, my name is Michelle Wolfman. I have Rachel graduated in 2012, Matthew graduated in 2015. And when I think of Israel, I think of all of the archaeology and all the ancient artifacts, and also really good food.
Thank you. Frank?
I have two GAN graduates, Rachel and Matthew. Hello, Michelle, and we couldn't have asked for a better both secular and Judaic education. When I think of Israel, I think of the future of Judaism and a Judaic safe place.
A safe place after the horrors of Eastern Europe of the 40s, 30s, and 40s.
Good, thank you. Next, where it says my daughter's a senior, I think it was for Sophia before. My daughter's a senior, Esther Hausman, and then Maria.
Hi, my name is Deborah, and my daughter is Sophia. She's going to graduate this year. And the two words that come to mind when you ask what comes to mind about Israel is Jewish state and conflict.
My name is Esther Hausman. I have two graduates. Ari was 2008 and Hannah was 2012. And the first word that came to mind was beauty. And then a few seconds later was Jewish homeland.
I just realized we have two Marias. So Maria Nuria first, and then Maria, the parent of the 11th grader. So thank you. Maria Nuria first, please. Oh, can't hear you.
Marie, if you want to put your word into the chat, we can get it that way.
Yes. Good. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so thank you for that. We'll look forward to that. Maybe let's continue on. So Maria, the parent of the 11th grader.
Hi, my name is Maria Granik. My daughter Nina is in 11th grade. When I think of Israel, I think of religious history, but also my family because my husband is from Israel.
Thank you. For our next three, Liz, the aunt of Sophia, Michelle Lieberman, and Susan, please.
I'm Liz. I'm in Portland, Oregon, and Sophia's my niece, and I think of very complicated feelings.
Hi, my name is Michelle Lieberman. I have a 9th grader. And when I think of Israel, I think of Jewish history and conflict.
Okay. Susan, please.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So I have been to Israel once. I can say that it is the most interesting, complex, amazing, historical, old, full of learning place that I can't wait to go back to. And as far as GAN, I have two sons yet to graduate. Hopefully they will both successfully do that, and appreciative for everything that you've done to contribute to their Jewish identity and beyond.
Thank you. All right, for our next three, we'll have the one labeled as Zoom user, Marcy and Bruce and Arlene. Okay, so if the person in the Zoom user, if you'd like to speak, you can, or if you prefer to put in the chat, that's fine also. Let's go on to Marcy and Bruce then, please.
Hi, it's Bruce Lipsy and my wife Marcy. Two GAN grads, Jared and Adam. When I think of Israel, I think of the restoration of strength of the Jewish people.
And I think of very dear friends that we have in Israel, multiple generations going back to my grandparents and my friends' grandparents. And yeah.
Thank you. Arlene.
Hi, I'm Arlene. Nice to see some familiar faces. My two boys, I'm very impressed people know when their kids graduate. I have no idea. I have two alumni sons that graduated at some point in the last 10 years. And when I think my first reaction was Homeland, and then when people are talking about the food, the best pita in the entire world is in Israel. Thanks. Nice to be here.
Good. And for our last set, I noticed folks who don't have the camera on, you're welcome. If you like to unmute and share or put in the chat, it's fine. Oh, good. So I think, so Steve, we'll start with you, then Michelle, then Cheryl. So Steve
Hello.
first, please.
Steve Novick, and my daughter Daphna is a junior again. And I think about how amazing it is that we have a Jewish homeland, and times that I've been there and what I read about it, just like in Startup Nation, how amazing that Israel is thriving so much and making such amazing contributions to the world.
Thank you. The one that's just Michelle. We've got a few Michelles, one that's just the name Michelle, if you would like to share your thought.
Sorry about that, guys. I have little kids in the background.
Oh, no trouble.
Getting ready. So hold on.
Yeah.
Hi, so I'm Michelle, and I have a current student who's a junior, Noah, and a graduate, and two little boys running around the house. So it's a joy to be able to join you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to answer the question. One of the little boys shouted out that the answer should be Sabra. That's my 9-year-old.
Lovely. Excellent. Cheryl.
I'm here with one of my graduates, my daughter Laurel, and we have 3 other graduates. I have no idea when they graduated, so sorry.
2006.
Okay, there's one. When I think of Israel, I think of the words nation and diverse or diversity. What about you, Laurel?
I think of the word complicated, and my dad thought of the word conflict.
Thank you. And finally, I believe I've got 12, it would be Vicky, Elle Spiegel, and Ellen. And again, if you can't unmute, that's fine in the chat, or if you'd like to and share, that's great. So we'll start with Vicky, please.
So I'm Vicky Lyon, and I'm friends with Debbie and Jonathan Foreman. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for doing this. And I think of I feel safe and comfortable being Jewish in Israel.
Thank you. Okay, Elle Spiegel, please. Or in the chat if you prefer, is fine. And same for Ellen, if either would like to share.
Hi, I'm Ellen. I graduated in 2005. I thought this would be a good refresher course with 2 of my favorite teachers from high school. So looking forward to this. And when I think of Israel, I honestly think of conflict. I'm going to shut my camera back off though, because I have this little guy.
Understood. Thank you, for sure. And good. And really, thank you all for joining us. You know, Elle Spiegel, if you'd like to share now or in the chat is totally fine. But let's really think about this, the answers that we heard. There was both a lot of continuity and difference, certainly. Homeland came up many times, and Startup Nation kind of themes, complexity, conflict, all that's wrapped into an Israel course. And for us, it's important that everyone thinks about what it is, what those associations are, because the word that I would say, and that we as a GAN Israel education team would say first, is the word connection. What are the ways in which we feel connected to this topic, to this story? We want that to be front of mind as we think about and explore the ideas together, so that you can get out of this course what you hope to. And even if we don't cover those ideas, that we also can be resources to you to find out those answers and things that excite you about Israel. But we want them also to inform the questions that you have and the lenses that bring you with us for this 4-part series. So with that, we're going to return to the slide show together. But keep thinking about those words, and it'll be interesting to see if they change over time. So at GAN, it's approaching now a decade, not quite, but as a GAN team, we've really thought a lot about what is Israel education look like. And these are the three frames in which we think about any endeavor that we do, whether an adult education course like this, working with our students on a class, things like the Israel Experience that GAN organizes. We think in terms of connection, knowledge, and stance. And we want to say a quick word about those words because they'll frame some of the ways in which we'll interact through Zoom together over these sessions. And hopefully it'll be a helpful framework for you when you're in future conversations about Israel with others. You can think of connection, knowledge, and stance as heart, head, and hand as a way to think about it. So connection is the heart side of things. What is that emotional tie that one has to Israel? Could be, some of you mentioned family or food or memories, those that kind of warm the heartstrings or give you that sense of connection, of feeling when it comes to the topic of all kinds. That's what we mean by connection. Knowledge refers to the head, and that's the core of what we'll do. Knowledge, history, ideas, concepts together. And then stance is what happens when a person puts together his or her or their connection and knowledge. That's kind of where they stand. It may not be where they stand forever, but it's a way in which they synthesize the heart and the head, the feelings and the ideas. And through this course is going to be a combination of those three lenses of connection, like topics that are connected to emotion and ideas, certainly knowledge, key topics, history, and so forth, and also presenting you with different stances and ways of thinking about Israel. And we as a school, through the years, when we think about classes, we are deeply committed to students having deeper connections when they started, whether a course like this or being with us for 4 years, that they have more connections than when they started. Same with knowledge. Wherever one comes in, and some may have more or less knowledge, some of this may be review for you, some may be new for the first time, but that your knowledge will grow in some way. Those were our goals. How you'll put that together is what's called stance. And that is something that we cannot predetermine for you, because all of you come in with different backgrounds and experiences, will connect in different ways to our material. But our hope is through this course, that'll be a connection of putting those connections and knowledge together. It'll help to inform a stance, think about how you want to think about ideas, and even if you don't come up with a stance, be on a journey to think about the major concepts and ideas that we'll explore together. So that connection, knowledge, stance is a framework we'll talk about. There are many quotes about history. This is the one that's my favorite, even though if you dig deeply, some aren't actually sure if Mark Twain actually said it or was attributed to him later, but I still think it's the best quote about history. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Right? Some of you may know Joseph Santayana from Harvard said, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And I think history doesn't repeat itself fully, as this quote says, but it does rhyme. There are notions of continuity, ways in which history can be similar, one moment, one idea, one leader, one person, one thought to the other. But there are also notions where they're not exactly the same. So when it rhymes, when it doesn't. Rhyme means there's something similar, but also to know where history is different as time goes on. And that's going to be one of the themes of the course. You'll hear some continuity in questions, thoughts, and ideas, but also change over time. And that's what we'll show on the next slide of how rhymes are going to play out both in this lesson and the lessons to come. What's interesting about the history of Zionism in Israel is that so many of the key moments end with the number 7. Just that's one of the rhymes. You can see here, 1897, 1917, 1937, and by the next class, 1947 is important, 1967, 77, all these years with 7 just happen to be milestone turning point moments. But we've picked these 3 as the ones to focus on when it comes to Hatikva, the hope. 1897 being the first Zionist Congress, which really debated the idea, for whom and for what purpose is the Jewish state? What is Zionism all about? And that Congress and its conversations play out to this very day, including Israel's 5th election in 3.5 years that's going to take place next week. You can't fully understand it. We're having some sense of the questions asked all the way back when this first Zionist Congress was formed, a half century before a state of Israel. It was thinking about the purpose of this Jewish state. That plays out politically all the time in all the conversations that one has. So that's why we're going to start there. Another key turning point is 20 years, 2 decades later, the Balfour Declaration. This recognition by the British government of an idea of a home for the Jewish people. What role does the international community play in shaping Zionism? Is going to be another key part of our course, and we'll unpacking that key moment. And then finally, yet another 20 years later, also with the British government involved, the Peel Commission. And this moment, one of the first ideas and proposals around something that approaches the two-state solution, whose idea that we'll trace over our 4 sessions. How does Zionism shape modern Israeli politics? We think understanding this moment, and particularly the leaders of David Ben-Gurion and Vladimir Jabotinsky, just like the wonderful American show Hamilton, where it's Hamilton and Jefferson. If you know them, you understand American politics to this day. We make the same contention here for understanding these two figures, helps you understand, again, modern Israeli politics and conversation around that moment and the things they talk about in 1937. And you see the images as well on the right that will cover those topics. So most of our course is very modern in orientation, but we would be remiss if we didn't say something, of course, about history. So in a course like this, we have to be selective what to talk about. We at least want to give a couple of slides to what is that long-standing connection? Where does one start the story when it comes to the history of Zionism in Israel? And there are many different choice points one can make. Some of them are the ones recognized here. And a lot of these have to do with moments of Jewish sovereignty, not only Jewish presence in the land, but having some sense of sovereignty, rule, authority. Going back to David's conquest of Jerusalem over 3 millennia ago, to Solomon's temple, to exile and return to the land, to the Hasmonean revolt, which is the story of Hanukkah, a destruction of the Second Temple in diaspora, and a revolt happening in 135. These are all key moments in any history. Certainly in Israeli schools, these are all given in particular importance because, again, they tell the story of Jewish not only presence, but sovereignty in the land. And just about all the items here also are tied to archaeological evidence that one can bring to show and demonstrate that Jewish presence. And one of you mentioned archaeology as your word, which makes a lot of sense. You see archaeology when you tour the land, and the role that archaeology plays in the history of the state is so important, and often will tie to one or more of the moments that we see here. But by the last date on the timeline, after 135, there's always a continuous Jewish presence in Israel, but for most of the Jews, then in the diaspora, for centuries, it's a hope to return, but for many, it's something that's more abstract, it's more spiritual. It's not something that many would achieve in their lifetime. You think about a Passover Seder, Lashana Ba'ah B'Yerushalayim, that kind of hope. Next year in Jerusalem, we'll do the Seder. Was a hope declared, not actually realized for many in their own lifetime. Some did make that pilgrimage, were able to, but not for many. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. So there's this idea of Israel as a hope, an idea, and a prayer, which again, in prayers, I mentioned the Seder, but also this idea of Israel became an abstract idea which could be realized elsewhere. So as you see in the quotes on the left, one Chabad of Hasidut, of the Hasidic movement, said, make here, it could be here in Poland, where we are. That could be the land of Israel. We don't actually have to go there. We can be that promised land where we are elsewhere in the world. And the Rabbi Eli Melech said, when you come visit me, you're in the land of Israel. You can achieve that through other means, not actually traveling to the physical place itself. And as you see in the lower right, blessing about rebuilding Jerusalem speedily in our days, that's something of for divine intervention, for God to be involved with, not something that, again, people would actualize by themselves. So one part we're going to look at tonight is, how does that start to shift? What changes? Why in the modern period does it become not just a few individuals making that choice, but more of a mass movement deciding to move it from the abstract to the real, to moving, to imagining, but also really to building a Jewish home in the modern period. And with that, I'm going to pass this to Yoni to tell the next part of the story.
Thank you. Everybody, so many wonderful, familiar faces. Good to see all of you. Right, so as John said, this is the first part of the modern story of Zionism. Begins in Europe. And it's actually in many ways an unlikely beginning for a movement of Jews to return to Israel, because as we pointed out, Israel was more of an idea. It was a hope, it was a prayer. We say it in our tefillot daily. Will God please return us or restore us? But for most Jews, it was more prayer than anything else. And the idea that we should be picking ourselves up and moving back to Israel, either to live there or to even more unlikely to set up a state, was just something that Jews were not thinking about by and large. A handful of Jews accepted. For example, Ramban argues, Nachmanides argues it's a commandment for Jews to live, and he does ultimately bring a few of his students with him to live out the rest of his days in Israel, but most don't. And it got much more unlikely in Europe in the 1800s. Why? Largely because of developments like the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Out of the Enlightenment in Europe, the idea that human beings should be treated with equality, that religions should not be treated as second-class religions or should be treated poorly. Jews start to emerge out of both the literal and figurative ghettos of Europe. In one of the first locations that it happens is in France during the French Revolution. And one of the most famous statements of the French Revolution in 1789 was the Jews, and you can see it here in the top right corner of the slide, the Jews should be denied everything as a nation, but granted everything as individuals. We do not want to have nations, they said nations within nations. We do not want to have, ghettoized people. Rather, we want everybody in France to be treated as individuals with equality. And that would mean equality to find jobs, equality in politics, equality even in the most sacred institutions like the army. You can serve in the military and not only serve in the military, but achieve rank in the military. And we'll talk about what that means in a few moments. In Russia and in Eastern Europe, when the Enlightenment starts to make it there, out into the Eastern European areas, they call it the Haskalah. And Eastern European Jews like Yehuda Leib Gordon here, you can see underneath, also think about Jews in this very individualistic way. Be a man, Yehuda Leib Gordon says to his fellow Jews, be a man abroad and a Jew in your tent, meaning keep your Judaism really hidden and be a good Russian or a good Pole or a good whatever it was out in the real world. And so you can see this idea of emancipation, the individualism really spreading. And if you look at the map here on the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the places where it spreads, starting in France and then spreads eastward across Europe. And for many, many Jews, that meant, and so here you can see where Jews were living by and large, they're living largely in Eastern Europe, some in Central and Western Europe. But for many, many Jews, particularly in Western Europe, it looks kind of like this, the emancipation does. It looks like Franz Kafka, it looks like Sigmund Freud, it looks like Theodor Herzl, it looks like Alfred Dreyfus. I've just named all the people from left to right in your screen. These are Jews who largely lived in places like Prague and in Vienna and in Paris. And the story of Alfred Dreyfus, who is all the way over, whose story we're going to refer to a couple of times, is truly emblematic of the Jew of Central and Western Europe, where Alfred Dreyfus's great-grandparents, who lived outside of Paris in one of the smaller cities in what ultimately becomes France, borders shift back and forth between Germany and France, etc., were butchers. And they were, largely what we would consider to be Ashkenazi, very religious butchers. They described their small town as one that was reminiscent of what we would think of as shtetls, where you would have somebody, they described the klopper knocking on the windows to saying it's time, at 6:30 in the morning, saying it's time to wake up and go daven, and the smell of cholent in the air, and all of the things we'd associate with Orthodox Eastern European living. His great-grandparents, Alfred Dreyfus's great-grandparents, were living that way. But as emancipation continued to grow and continued to spread, his great-grandfather's child's son became just a little less religious and a little more acculturated, until we arrive 4 generations down to Alfred Dreyfus, who he himself is a colonel a captain in the French army. What has happened? You have had Jews who have moved from their shtetl communities into the upper echelons of French society. And he looks like any other Frenchman. He speaks French and barely recognizes his own Judaism. Whether or not you would give your child a Hebrew name or a bar or bat mitzvah was completely now up to the individual. And in this list, very few of them did. Very few of these people gave their children Hebrew names or had bar bat mitzvahs for their children. So the fact that you would have this idea that we are going to return to a Jewish homeland, that we're going to leave this place behind, this European, for many ways, this golden age for Jews behind, was incredibly unlikely. So where does Zionism come from? Why does Zionism, this movement that Jews start to follow in Europe in the late 1800s, that we need to pick ourselves up and move back to create a Jewish state, to create a Jewish homeland? Where does that come from? That's the story we're going to start looking at now. And it's complicated. Many of the tellings of Zionism say that it comes out of violence, that it comes out of a resurgence of pogroms in Russia. And to be sure, it is true that in the 1880s and 1890s, for political reasons we're not going to get into now, there was a resurgence of violence against Jews in pogroms. And several are cited as being particularly horrible. The Kishinev pogrom, for example, in 1903 is cited by many people that we're actually going to be looking at, Rav Kook, etc., who look at mass violence where hundreds of Jews are oftentimes slaughtered and unspeakable violence committed against Jewish communities, turn people away from the belief that they could live and thrive in Russia or in Europe, wherever they were, and turn their heads towards Palestine, as it was called at the time. And it's partly the answer. It is definitely true that for many people, that violence was a part of their turn towards Zionism. But historians have really complexified that question. And I want to think about that question for a few moments. Because anti-Semitism and violence against Jews is nothing new. The response to anti-Semitism, we're reading now from the left column, the response to anti-Semitism had generally been either to wait it out, as had oftentimes been the case, suffer through it, or to move to the next closest safe haven. It is why, for example, Poland and Eastern Europe in general become the haven for Jews for hundreds of years. It was from violence or persecution in one place or another, be it in Germany or Spain, etc. You just moved next door. And the idea was not that we need to pick ourselves up and move to Israel. It was we move to the next country. The idea that Jews should resolve their problems in wherever they happen to be in Europe at this time with a state of their own, that was new in the 1800s. And so the question is why? Why now? What's going on now that brings about for Jews this idea of a state, that we can resolve our problems with a state? And much of that has to do with the simultaneous movement in the 1800s, simultaneous to emancipation. The other great movement of the 1800s was this idea of nationalism, also born of the French Revolution. That we, a people who speak a common language, perhaps worship a common God in a specific way, so it's not just, Christianity, but it's a specific kind of maybe Protestant faith or Catholicism, etc., or a specific kind of Catholic, whatever it was. We speak a common language, we have common lullabies, we eat common food, etc. People start to think of themselves as nations. And so, for example, one of my favorite examples is this little orange guy right here in the middle of Europe called the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It had been an empire for a long time. And what really started to challenge the empire was when this idea of nationalism from France started making its way eastward and awakening the various people who lived inside this orange Austrian empire. And here's what it looks like up close, this empire. Because the empire was in fact actually a conglomeration of lots and lots of people. You have Germans, you have Hungarians, you have Slovaks, you have Czechs, you have Poles, etc., etc. And they hadn't forgotten their languages, they hadn't forgotten their fairy tales, they hadn't forgotten their food and folk ways, etc. And they start to think of themselves rather than as Austrians. What's an Austrian? I don't even know I don't know what an Austrian is. There's no Austrian ethnicity here. And they rather start thinking themselves as a nation. We are the nation of Poles. We are the nation of Czechs. And they start asking themselves, why should we be living in somebody else's state? Can't we have a state of our own? And they start clamoring for states of their own. The Hungarians and the Czechs and the Germans, well, the Germans say we'd like to be reunited perhaps with a different German state. Croatia, etc., etc. And that is where this idea of the nation state in many ways comes from. And they express it in many different ways, but among them are anthems. We'll talk about anthems for a few moments. And all of these different ethnicities create their own anthems. And you can see this is all a 19th century thing, 1834, 1844, the nation of the Czechs. You don't have an anthem before 1834. And now they start to talk about, where is my home? Where is my home? Water roaring across meadows, pines whisper across crags. And so some of them talk about the beauty of their country, the nature, etc. Others talk about vengeance and armies. Some of them talk about God, but they all have one thing in common, is that we are a people and we're going to sing and really pray to God to really protect, look out for, and to create a nation and a state for our individual people. And that's really, again, all happening in the 1800s. And so it is not an accident that you start to see as persecution starts to emerge in certain places in Eastern Europe, but also in Western Europe, and we'll talk about where this comes from as well, that you start to see similar national features emerging out of Jewish corners as well. And here's one of the first ones. So it comes from Theodor Herzl, who we're going to look at in a few moments, who notes, as all of the other nations are creating anthems and flags, well, we should have one too. And as Herzl, Theodor Herzl, again, will tell you where he comes to his nationalism from in a few moments. He's looking for sponsors. So he goes to the wealthy Europeans where he lived. And so one of them was the Hirsch family. And they're talking about why Hirsch should you give money to this nationalist cause? And one of the things that Herzl really is promoting is this idea of a flag. And Hirsch is sort of mocking this idea of a flag, not fully getting this idea of nationalism. Where Herzl says, you would have asked mockingly, a flag, what is that? A stick with a rag on it? No, sir, he says. A flag is more than that. With a flag, one can lead men wherever one wants, even into the promised land. For a flag, men live and die. This is this idea that nationalism is something that people are really starting to give their lives to. And we'll talk, John mentioned the number 7. And so in the original Jewish flag, Herzl has 7, you'll notice 7 little stars in here. There's the big Jewish star in the middle, there's 7 other little stars, which represent the 7 hours of the workday. We'll come back to what that means in a few moments and why that would be, of all things, to stick symbolically into the middle of the Jewish flag, this new Jewish nationalistic flag, the 7 hours of workday. We'll come back to that in a few moments. But in any event, the Jews themselves, as they start to think about their own nation and their own nation state, also create their own anthem and national anthem as well. And so we'll play just a little bit of that now. I need to set that up in just a second. I have to get the, hold on. Oh, I don't know if that's working. 1 second here. Let's see if it's not shared. Oh, there we go. All right, so.
Switch and save $652.
Okay, we're getting there. All right.
The thing that's different about a
So
group
now you have to
vacation
play
is
ads. I apologize
you
for that.
always have the whole place to yourself.
All right. I'm going to share sound and make this work. All right, so you may recognize this tune. And here we go. Okay. You guys recognize that? Sounds a lot like the tune that goes with these words here, otherwise known as the Jewish national anthem or the Israeli national anthem, which was written in 1878 and was set to music by yes, Samuel Cohen is the one who set it to the music, but yes, the original score is Smetana's The Moldau, describing a gorgeous river running through Prague. And it is, and again, yet again, the Central and Western European roots of Zionism really in many ways are at the core of the Jewish national project. Just as a fun little Boston connection, the original design for the flag, actually, yes, Herzl had his own, but the one that actually looks closest like the one that we have today with the stripes and the star in the middle without the other 7 stars, was developed actually in 1891 by Jacob Asquith and actually made its first appearance right near the North End, or in the north, was at the time the North End of Boston, and that's a story that we can tell another time. But it has American and Boston roots as well. So these are the core of the symbols of Jewish nationalism. So why is it that with the violence happening in Eastern Europe, the pogroms are happening in Russia, in many ways, Zionism, at least the Zionism that we are most familiar with, Herzl, the flag, the music, etc., are coming out of Central and Western Europe. A lot of that actually has to do with what the people who would ultimately establish leadership of modern Zionism are people who come out of Western Europe. And one of the big stories that really brought that about was the story of our friend Alfred Dreyfus, who you'll remember from a few slides ago. Alfred Dreyfus over there on the right was our captain in the French army who had achieved the highest rank that a Jew had ever in French history, and was seen as any other Frenchman, is accused by the army of selling spies to the hated enemy, the Germans. Now, while evidence pretty quickly comes out that he was not guilty of that, he was tried anyway, he was found guilty, and he's stripped of his captaincy. And France is torn asunder by this trial. Fist fighting on the streets, families torn apart. Those who support Dreyfus, they in fact actually give themselves a name called Dreyfusards, and people are anti-Dreyfusards, and there's fighting, and the anti-Semitism that emerges out of this, and you can see just one example of that on the right. For many, many people, including Theodor Herzl, who is also pictured here next to Dreyfus, Theodor Herzl was Viennese to his core. He saw himself as a good German. He spoke German. He loved German culture. He loved Viennese culture. And in fact, was actually a well and highly regarded writer in Viennese circles, Jewish and non-Jewish circles. Highly respected. Was sent as a reporter for a Viennese newspaper to cover the trial. And he was in Paris covering the trial. And for him, he had already been thinking a little bit about whether Jews truly have a place in Western Europe. But for him, this proved that as much as they can emancipate us, as high as we can go in the army, in any sort of social circle, we will always just be Jews. We cannot get rid of it. Too many people in Europe. And so this most acculturated German from Vienna turns his hopes east. And he writes one of the most famous books of Zionism called The Jewish State, or Der Judenstaat. And it's actually covered in, now the book itself, but certainly the Congress that emerges out of it. In the media, there's an article, for example, from the New York Times about the Congress that he sets up. But first he writes in his book, we Jews are naturally drawn into those places where we are not persecuted, and our appearance there gives rise to persecution. This is the case and will inevitably be so everywhere, even in highly civilized countries. See, for instance, France, so long as the Jewish question is not solved on the political level. We are a people, one people. We have sincerely tried everywhere to merge with the national communities in which we live. It is not permitted to us. In vain, we are loyal patriots. In our native lands where we have lived for centuries, we are still decried as aliens. Let the sovereignty be granted us over a portion of the globe large enough to satisfy the rightful requirements of a nation. Again, this idea of the nation state. The rest we shall manage for ourselves. We shall live at last as free men in our own soil, in our own homes, peacefully die. And for Herzl, the idea was not that we needed a homeland for Jewish culture to thrive or so our religion can survive, but rather because even as we've tried to strip ourselves of our culture and religion, it doesn't matter. We are always at our core Jews as far as people of the world are concerned. So we just need a place where we can safely live. And as far as he's concerned, that flag that he draws is emblematic of what he wanted. These 7 stars represent the seven hours of the workday. He wasn't thinking about kibbutzim, about dawn to dusk farm labor, or a center for Torah learning, as others would think. For him, I want to pick up Vienna or Berlin and drop it into the Middle East. He writes about wanting Jewish bankers, Jewish policemen, and Jewish prostitutes. At that point, you will know we have a truly, actually, the Jewish state may actually not be the right name for this. And in fact, many historians have argued it's mistranslated. It shouldn't be the Jewish state. It should be the state for the Jews, is what it really should be called. Now, what's fascinating is that Herzl himself was devastated when his book was not reprinted in German other than once. It is, however, reprinted over and over and over again in Hebrew and in Yiddish in Eastern Europe. The Eastern Europeans love it. And Herzl becomes, in many ways, and he was not, by the way, Herzl, the first to write these ideas. Fellows like Leo Pinsker had come before, wrote a book called Auto-Emancipation. We need to pick ourselves up and create our own state. And yet his books are not the ones that really get traction. It's Herzl's, the Western European Jew. Many Eastern European Jews look to the West as the cultivated, civilized Jews. And so for them, for many of those Jews who are really starting to think about Zionism as an answer to their problems, look to Herzl. And they reprint Der Judenstaat and his other works over and over and over again. While meanwhile, many of the Jews of Western and Central Europe, like Stefan Zweig, say there's a general astonishment and annoyance with bourgeois Jewish circles in Vienna. What has happened, they said angrily, to this otherwise intelligent, witty, and cultured writer, referring to Herzl? Why should we go to Palestine? Our language is German, not Hebrew, and our beautiful Austria is our homeland. Are we not well off under the good Emperor Franz Joseph, he says? But in Eastern Europe, they are starting to galvanize. And it's largely going to be the ideas of Herzl, where he's going to gather people in Western-style congresses with the muscle and the work of your Eastern European Jews, Russians and Poles, Romanians, like David Ben-Gurion, who are then going to pick up and do the labor of developing that new land, moving from Russia and Poland, etc., to the actual place of Palestine, as it was called, to do the work of developing that land. And so for people like David Ben-Gurion, yes, the ideas of Herzl are important and nice, and we definitely need the money to make it happen. And we need political recognition from the other countries that Herzl is seeking. But ultimately, we have to get our fingers dirty in the soil and actually build this thing in order to make it into a state. And what's going to come out of that Eastern and Western European divide is our next part of the story. And John's going to tell us about that.
Continue to feel free if you have questions or comments, put them in the chat or raise your hand about any of it. But I want to bring us back to the initial go around that we had of when you think of Israel, what comes to mind? Because that kind of represents the different types of Zionism you can hear. For some, I remember one of your answers was around safe haven, homeland, and the like. And we're now going to shift to a different type of Zionism, a different type of ways that people connect to the land. And a lot of this to do with this question of language, as Yoni just mentioned. Some connect to their Jewish culture through Hebrew, perhaps some through Yiddish, perhaps through their native tongue, German or otherwise. And this is one of the biggest debates of the early days of the Zionist Congress. What should the language be of the country? What language should we speak? How should we interact with one another? What should the language of this new Jewish home be? And Yoni gave you some good examples, and you have a few pictures of the slides here. As we go to the next slide, Ahad Ha'am, Asher Ginsburg, his pen name was Ahad Ha'am, one of the people, was certain for him the language really needed to be Hebrew. And that was something settled early on, early of the Zionist Congress, because that is how Jewish life and expression had been over time. And that's what would bring it back to life in the modern period. And I just want to read here from his quote, which I think says a lot about what he imagined Zionism meant, not just for those who they themselves would travel, but his recognition that many Jews are not going to make the choice to travel. But still, Zionism and a center in the land of Israel could infuse life and energy for those who are outside of it. As the quote we've selected here. And notice it's in the year 1897. So the same time of this first Zionist Congress, Ahad Ha'am is writing these words where he writes, Judaism needs at present but little. It needs not an independent state, but only a good-sized settlement of Jews working without hindrance in every branch of culture, from agriculture and handicrafts to science and literature. This Jewish settlement, which will be a gradual growth, will become in the course of time the center of the nation, wherein its spirit will find pure expression. Then from this center, the spirit of Judaism will go forth to the great circumference, to all the communities of the diaspora, and will breathe new life into them and preserve their unity. We desire a Jewish state and not merely a state of the Jews. There, of course, a reference to Herzl's vision, not just a place where Jews live in the safe haven, which may look European and bourgeois, but what is its Jewish character? What role does Hebrew language play? How can new culture created there also inspire Jews around the world? And when you bring that forward to our own time, whether all the wonderful Israeli shows on Netflix through which people connect to Israel in one way, or something like a Birthright program, where a taste of Israel for a small time, seeing its culture and vitality, diversity that some of you reference, how does that infuse those who spend 10 days and then go back to their homes, infused and connected with the culture as much of the place? That's something that you see. And even this is just one example of one of those quotes by Eric Yalfi, longtime leader of the Reform movement, who talks about survival is not creative survival without the vibrancy of a Jewish majority culture, without a place where Hebrew is the language of every day. And when Jews can apply Jewish values to every aspect, without that interplay, Jewish life will be dramatically devalued. And that's why Zionism must be, you take possession of Zionism once again. It's something I quoted, thought about all the time. What role has and can Israel play in one's Jewish identity in the diaspora? And so we really pose that question to all of you to think about. Of these, is it one of these models that kind of resonates with you and your own connection to Zionism? Is it that notion of a safe haven for Jews around the world? Is it cultural? Certainly it can be both, but just kind of worth a temperature check for which ones kind of resonate with all of you as you think about, what brought you to the course and the learning that we'll do together. Good. So did you want Yoni to set up, should we have breakout groups for this or do this as a ask in the gallery? How do you think? How do you like to proceed? Yeah, so what we'd like to do is we want to have some time for community with one another to speak. So in a moment, Yoni's just going to put you all into breakout groups for a couple of minutes to think about the different types of Zionism that we've shared thus far. Again, Zionism as a safe haven versus a cultural expression. So in your breakout groups, think about which of those resonates with you, or perhaps there's a third, another one that you've talked about with others. So Yoni will create those groups now, and we'll come back and share with one another.
Hi, Seth.
Hello, Nancy. How are you?
Tired. I'm sorry. I've been yawning pretty much the last hour, but it's been a long day.
Yeah.
I find
Understood.
what they're saying fascinating, but I wish I were a little bit more awake to be able to absorb it all.
It is definitely a lot of information.
And I'm thrilled to be hearing it. It's just hard to take in at 7:30 at night.
Agreed. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
It's good. It's wonderful. It's absolutely just a terrific course. So much knowledge, really. It is.
So yes,
I'm a grandparent. My grandson's a senior at GAN.
Oh, nice. Who's your grandson?
Joshua Slater.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I told him we were going to take the course, and he was excited. He thought that would be great.
Nice.
And he was right.
So I guess what are your thoughts on the question from Yoni and Jonathan about, what is Israel? Is it more political Zionism? How do you resonate with that?
We better be quick. We have less than a minute.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, so I don't think it's one thing. I think it's everything, to tell you the truth. It's cultural, it's a homeland, it's a safe haven, it's a place we talk about and are proud of. I mean, I can't break it down to one thing.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. The funny thing is the term political, because I don't know that it's politics per se. Because I certainly don't really have any skin in the game when it comes to who the prime minister should be or anything like that. So it's not the political, it's not what we think of as politics in the US. But I think it's the sovereignty of a nation over themselves, which I guess is politics, but I see it as sovereignty more than political.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's hard. I don't know. I think for me, it's definitely a lot more cultural, I think, at this point.
Which resonates with me more? Should the teacher be answering? I don't know.
Now that we're recording, maybe not.
Dr. Golden, it's your turn.
My turn to say?
No, it's your turn to take over. Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, so we'll come to this question. We'd love to, if people want to raise a hand to share a thought, or you can put in the chat just either a thought that you had or something that you heard about what kind of, as you hear these ideas, what kind of feels alive in 2022 when it comes to Zionism. We'd love to hear just a few different answers. Again, that could be live, raise your hand, or feel free to put in the chat. Nancy. I think you're muted, Nancy. Sorry. If you want to mute. Yep.
Sorry. I want to redefine political as sovereignty, because I don't have any skin in the game when it comes to the actual politics, like we talk about politics in the US. But when I think about Israel, I think of us as a sovereign nation. And it's that sovereignty that's important more than the politics. But it's also cultural, so it was both.
Of course. Good. Anyone else like to share a thought? Yes, Helene.
We also, unfortunately, we didn't finish discussing, but one of the other things that arose in our talking was the idea of being able to experience our holidays in a way that felt so comfortable, and really not having to feel marginalized or outside the mainstream of the culture of the country that we were living in when we're in Israel.
Thank you. Good. Anyone else wanted to share a thought? Keep that question alive with you as we'll continue on, and we'll kind of come back to, again, the role that Zionism plays and how it plays out through its history and through its story. So if there, we're going to keep the story going to the next slide. So you can see in small numbers, Jews had made some presence. And if you look at the chart, the early aliyot, the early immigration waves that precede 1914, World War I, play a role here in the early emergence of the state. But then they start to jump, of course, between World War I and World War II. And that's the story we want to move to next. What is it that kind of galvanizes, that's the spark for more to take the kind of journey where not only it's a safe haven for others, or that Zionism would be a political center to give expression to Jews, who actually and why would they want to make such a move? And what are some of the contextual factors that lead to the growth of the Jewish community and Jewish life in the land of Israel? That's what we'll turn to next. And here we have to think about the British. And I can't help but thinking, like those who follow the news, what's happening today with the British having a third prime minister. And, you know, today, in recent days on social media, Israelis have an appreciation for the British for having a crazier political, less stable political system than their own. People thought 5 elections in 3.5 years is one thing, but having 3 prime ministers, you know, in a month and a half is another. But what's interesting, of course, too, is all the commentary and speculation. All right, with each prime minister, what do they think about the Jewish community, and what do they think about Israel in particular? Many reasons to ask that question, but of course, a big part of the resonance is the role that the British play in the land of Israel and the role that they play in the story of Zionism and in World War I, where the land of Israel, once part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, becomes part of the British as a result of World War I. And this declaration, thanks to the hard behind-the-scenes work of Chaim Weizmann, who became the first president of Israel, and his important chemistry work in explosives that was part of the British World War I effort, leads to this important declaration. And a declaration whose centennial, its 100th anniversary, was only celebrated 5 years ago, and had a lot of conversation and continues to have conversation about it, because this is outside recognition, which is important for any nation. How do others recognize or not one's claim to the land? And so this short letter has had such resonance, again, over the past 100+ years, 105 years coming up next month. And I want to kind of really look at this carefully, what the text said, and then we'll look at some responses to it in a few moments. So it reads as follows, when thinking about the aspirations of a Jewish homeland by the British government, those who were in charge at the time. His Majesty's government of the UK, of Britain, view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So a lot to say about this very pithy letter. There's a lot packed into it. So establishment in Palestine. It could have said of Palestine, meaning the entire territory, but it clearly applies some part of the territory, which is under British control at this time, would become a national home. Notice it doesn't say state, and forever historians have debated, did they intend it to be state? Would it just be a place where Jews could live and would not ultimately have sovereignty? Like any good diplomatic document, often some ambiguity, but the idea of this promise of a home is still strong from the outside, that others have promised, a national home for the Jewish people. And then the other parts in bold are important too. It notes that, as we saw in the earlier chart, the Jews are not the majority of the population. They're one of many different peoples there. And this letter promises that nothing will be done which will prejudice the civil and religious rights of non-Jewish communities, largely Arab communities, Christian, Muslim communities, etc. And I would just have you note, look what the promise says, which will be important for our story going forward. Civil and religious rights, rights under the law, rights to religious expression, but not national rights for others. The British intention here is that the Jews will have those rights, even having made promises elsewhere to the contrary, which is a key part to the background to the conflict. But here, just noting the civil and religious rights of different communities. or importantly, to the part that Yoni will get to in a moment, the political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. At the time, well, certainly many were happy, the safe haven and the expression of Hebrew. Others worried and had concern. What would it mean to have a Jewish homeland elsewhere for the status of myself as a European Jew or in other countries as a Jew in my own country? And that's put in there to kind of note that debate, even among many prominent figures in the UK, as we'll see momentarily. And this idea is so important that you see it in one of Israel's most important documents, its Declaration of Independence. You can see towards the middle after so Herzl is mentioned, we've talked about the Zionist Congress, and this idea of a Balfour Declaration. It was recognized by the Balfour Declaration, which is affirmed in international law, the mandate of the League of Nations, the UN's predecessor, which in particular gave international sanction to the historic connection between the Jewish people, Eretz Yisrael, and the right of Jewish people to rebuild its national home. Herzl was all about diplomacy. His work was meeting with the Kaiser of Germany, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, other world leaders to try to get that international recognition. That was his hope, his aspiration. That work continued with Chaim Weizmann in England. And this Balfour Declaration was a sign that those years of diplomatic effort took fruit to the point where it becomes part of this central document in Israel's history. Okay, and now, yes, and now it's back to Yoni for the next part.
So why did Britain ultimately issue this declaration is a really important question. And I want to actually drop back to a previous slide to answer the question. So you'll note here that the Jews had, over the course, really since the Zionist movement began in 1890, become, I wouldn't say sizable, but certainly they were a much bigger, there we go, a much bigger part of the population of Palestine. Right here, and you can see they have these dotted settlements up and down the Mediterranean seaboard, and then across the northern half as well. And they're setting up, they're buying some land, they're setting up farms. And so there's approximately in 1917, about 90,000, many Jews leave, 85, 86,000 Jews leave the what's called the Yishuv. That's what the Hebrew word for this settlement of Palestine. They leave, but there's roughly 85, 86,000 Jews. And the British, of course, want to win sympathy from as many corners of the globe as they possibly can. And the Jewish support for Britain at this point of the war in 1917 was not clear. Can we get Jewish support actually to keep Russia in the war was another question, because Russia is now in trouble and would they leave the war, et cetera. So can we get Jews to actively start supporting Great Britain was a significant question. And it was, just for example, with that young man right there, that's our friend David Ben-Gurion, who had been living in Palestine for about a decade, and he bet on the Turks. He was hoping the Ottoman Empire was going to win, and his support was not with the British. He turns it around, David Ben-Gurion writes, when the Balfour Declaration was issued. So it has the intended effect on people like David Ben-Gurion. And many, many Zionists would write, yes, some of them would write about pogroms like Kishinev, et cetera. Some would write about reading Herzl for the first time. Many of them would write about the Balfour Declaration as being the turning point for them, of both becoming Zionist and of supporting Great Britain in the war effort. And so it has the intended effect on people like Ben-Gurion. It doesn't, however, have the intended effect on other people living in Britain, and John alluded to this in the Balfour Declaration itself. It says it will not be, none of what's in the Balfour Declaration will prejudice the civil and religious rights of or political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country, including Great Britain. And that included people like Edwin Montague, who were leaders in the Jewish community and high-ranking in social circles, very proud Brits, who write after the Balfour Declaration is written, Zionism, he writes on the left here, Zionism has always seemed to me a mischievous political creed, untenable by any patriotic citizen of the United Kingdom. If a Jewish Englishman sets his eye on the Mount of Olives and longs for the day when he will shake British soil from his shoes and go back to agricultural pursuits in Palestine, he has always seemed to me to have acknowledged aims inconsistent with British citizenship, and to have admitted that he is unfit for a share in public life in Great Britain or to be treated as an Englishman. And so the Balfour Declaration, yes, has the impact of turning many towards Britain, but it actually scares many British Jews as well. Why are we talking about other places other than our beautiful homeland, Great Britain? That has a major impact on this individual, Rav Kook, and we're going to introduce him now. We're going to come back to him later. So Rav Kook, Abraham Isaac Kook, was a Russian rabbi. You can see he's got the full-on Hasidic shtreimel, the fur hat, and the long black coat, etc. And he is a rare bird in Orthodox circles for his embrace of Zionism. Zionism was largely seen as a secular creed, either because Herzl himself had no use for Judaism and his kid didn't have a bar mitzvah yet, so they are the prophets of Zionism, or from people like Ben Gurion who are saying the new future of Judaism is in the land and the soil of Israel. So for Rav Kook to come along and say that this is actually the will of God and the Torah demands that we embrace Zionism was a rare thing in Orthodoxy. And this, for many, many people, is the beginning of religious Zionism. Rav Kook really sees the Balfour Declaration as the work of God. And he drafts manifestos that are to be placed in shuls throughout London that will demand that people like Montague, on the right over here, start doing God's work and turning their eyes towards Zionism. We demand, he writes in this manifesto, full restitution for the land which has been robbed from us. The crime which cries into heaven must be completely corrected. And he goes on to say that Britain is the agent of God, and he starts talking about Zionism as a messianic creed. And we'll come back to that later on. So the Balfour Declaration has an impact in many, many ways across the Jewish community. Okay, so let's move the story forward. What happens next? Great Britain, along with the Allies, France, United States, win the war. And one of the major outcomes is that the old empires, Austria, the Ottoman Empire, etc., are dismantled and their pieces are broken up. The Austrian Empire famously becomes small countries like Czechoslovakia, Austria, etc., Hungary. And the Ottoman Empire is broken into pieces as well. At first, it is broken into the Palestine part of it is broken into one large chunk here, as you can see on the left, and was given to Great Britain. Part of the old Ottoman Empire here, which would become Syria, is given to France. Parts east are given also to Britain, etc., etc. The part we care about for our purposes is here in the yellow. And it was, you can see here, the Jordan River down the middle, a large swath of land that is both today what we call Israel, the West Bank, etc., and also this part is called Jordan. And the reason it's called Jordan is because in 1922, further treaties actually are made. We're not going to get into the politics of why, dividing the land that you see on the left into two. One is called Palestine, and the other one is called the Emirate of Transjordan, meaning the other side of the Jordan River. And for many Jews, that's fine. This is Palestine. We'll continue to settle here. For other Jews, that was an absolute betrayal of land that they believed was promised to them in the Balfour Declaration, and they would never forget it, and we'll come back to them shortly. But in any event, this would become Palestine and would become the mandate of Britain. What is a mandate? A mandate was the new version of, don't want to say colonialism because it wasn't quite Britain taking over. They were largely the old colonies that were given over to European powers like Britain and France as caretaker states, that we will watch over these pieces of land until they are ready for their own independence and statehood. So Palestine is given over as a mandate to Great Britain. And that is going to be the story that we look at next. So to very quickly take you through that, the war years between World War I and World War II were years of building in the Yishuv. You see cities being built, like Tel Aviv being built up. largely, by the way, looking like German Bauhaus cities in Berlin, etc. So it's not an accident that a lot of these Europeans are coming to settle and making their cities of Palestine look like their European cities. Some of them are looking like farms, yeshuvs, kibbutzim, moshavim, etc., where they're collective socialist endeavors that you see coming more out of the Eastern European side of the Jewish world. You have labor Zionism, where Zionism is really about our work. And of course, you have capitalism as well that's coming out of the cities as well. And so labor Zionism and the kibbutzim was really the work of David Ben-Gurion. He also sets up a socialist collective where you'll have labor unions coming out of something called the Histadrut. And capitalism is largely the vision of leaders like Vladimir Jabotinsky, who argues that what Ben-Gurion is doing, he called the cult of the cow, isn't going to get us what we need. This is a capitalist world we're living in. We need to set up a capitalist state. And they debate what the future of, as John said earlier, this is your Hamilton Jefferson sort of view of what the future of our state ought to be emerging here. But what both of them had a major hand in developing were all of the hallmarks of a state. So by 1947, which we'll get to in our next class, when Palestine is given over, at least in part, to the Jews, they are ready to go. They had done statecraft development. So they're paving roads, they're building infrastructure, they're collecting garbage, they're setting up electrical grids and plumbing and police forces and their own defense force, et cetera, that's getting trained by the British, et cetera. And so all of the practice that they'd had over centuries in Europe of building their own local communities is now being brought to bear in Palestine. And you can see it's really starting to pay off here again along the fertile valleys and soil of the northern region here and along the Mediterranean Sea. They are buying up and settling some of the best farmland that existed, and also they're developing new cities as well, like Tel Aviv. And slowly but surely, you have a Jewish community that's being built up there. The Arab population, the non-Jewish Arab population, which is measured in the hundreds of thousands, 750,000 roughly, are not happy with what they see as the trajectory of a perhaps state in the making, or some sort of a non-Arab and a Jewish, and many of them called a colonial state in the making, and they resist. They resist in several instances in 1921, they resist in 1929, we'll come back to that later on. But a major Arab, non-Jewish Arab uprising occurs in 1936. It begins as strikes. Arabs many of whom worked alongside or oftentimes for Jews, oftentimes in the orchards, in the cities they worked in stores, etc., go on strike. We're going to shut the country down, they said, and then it becomes violent. And it becomes, in many ways, the first outbreak of civil war between the Jews and non-Jewish Arabs. And the revolt goes on from 1936 to 1939. I'll just give you a few of the outcomes of this major revolt, and then we'll move forward. About 5,000 Arabs ultimately are killed in the revolt. About 300 Jews are killed in the revolt, but the impact actually went far, far beyond that. And in many ways, the Jews wrote, actually, the revolt was obviously terrible in the places where violence occurred and people lost loved ones, but actually had enormously important benefits for the Jews as well, because when the Arabs go on strike and refuse to work on the docks, or refuse to work in metalworks, etc., the Jews are forced to take a lot of these industries on themselves. And so they develop a port for the first time in Tel Aviv, move it out of Yaffo, and they move it to Tel Aviv. They develop the port, the seaport of Tel Aviv. They build metalworks, etc., and they ultimately end up replacing many of the Arabs' workers with Jewish workers. Another major outcome was training. Jews are actually trained by the British forces in military tactics, etc. Many of those who would come to lead the Haganah, the Jewish Defense Forces, later on in the 1940s, speak of this moment, this 1936 to 1939 moment, as the key training ground for them from a military perspective as well. A final major outcome, actually I'll talk about two more major outcomes of the revolt, was the destruction of Palestinian leadership. Partly because many of them are jailed during this time period, and also because there was actually internal civil war among Palestinian leadership as well as to what shape the revolt should take. And they end up in many ways with an internal civil war among Arab leadership as well. So between Arab leadership who are either jailed or end up fighting amongst each other, the Arab political leadership is actually in many ways decimated and would leave the Arabs without major leadership for the next 10 years, leaving their community bereft when 1947 would come along and Jewish statehood would be proclaimed and the Arabs pushed back. Their leadership in many ways was decimated at that point from this revolt. The other final piece is that this is for many Palestinians the development of their own identity. They would speak of this revolt as an important moment for the development of Arab Palestinian identity, where many of them for the first time start calling themselves Palestinian. The word is actually long predates this. It goes back to the late 1800s, the word Palestinian, but many Palestinian Arabs for the first time see themselves specifically as Palestinian. Finally, you'll notice the dates 36 to 39. This is the real rise of Hitlerism and Nazi Germany, and Great Britain, the mandate chief at this point, is worried less about what's going on here and much more about what's going on in Europe, in their backyard with Nazi Germany on the rise. And for them, the most important thing they can really focus on is ensuring that Nazism and Hitlerism does not take over Great Britain. And out of this moment, they passed the White Paper, which restricts Jewish migration to Palestine. And the reason they do that is because they realize with war coming that they would need Arab support as well, or primarily Arab support in order to fight the war and to get oil out of the region. And Jewish immigration to Palestine might cause the Arabs to turn their back on Britain. And so they passed this white paper, which severely restricts immigration just at a time when Jews were going to be needing a place to go. And that takes us up to 1937. John, do we want to tell the story next time?
Yeah, this we're going to save for next time, but just wanted to give you an image of, this is a vision of the first kind of two-state solution. Could there be two states for two peoples? And we'll begin next time with the debate about visions. Could this work or not, and why or why not, and the echoes it has until today. So with that, we'll conclude here and pass the mic back to Jude for some quick wrap-up comments, and when we see you in 2 weeks. So Jude, please.
Thank you. Yoni, do you mind? Yeah, you're screen sharing still. Perfect. Love to see everybody. I'm just so grateful that you all stuck it out for the hour and a half here. There's a lot of information. So thank you for listening. I know the game is on momentarily. I'll make this really quick in terms of a wrap up. But one of the things I just want to say is that we are recording and the documents are available to look at again. I think will be really helpful to keep everybody's top of mind for everyone. So in terms of next steps and details, our next session is going to be November 7th. Mark your calendars. We're not meeting next week because it's Halloween, so you get to go out and enjoy, perhaps if those of you who imbibe in that tradition. So we will be back online again in 2 weeks on the 7th, and then the 14th and 21st are the other dates. But I just want to add two other quick things. One is, if you know anyone in the greater GAN community that you think would be interested in joining, who didn't see around the Zoom room, there are many other folks who have registered. Please have them be in touch with Seth or myself. We want to, again, Seth is waving, but at the bottom of my screen, because we want to make sure that people feel that this is something that they can participate in. And again, we are recording, so what's nice is we can play catch up with them, and they can have an opportunity to be able to hear the recording and see the materials. One other thing is, for those of you who don't know about my nonprofit Tribe Talk, for those who want to learn more about the work that we do, really educating the future of the Jewish community and the future of the Jewish leaders, please don't hesitate to contact me, and we'll share my Seth will pop my email into the chat. I just want to thank Seth, because without Seth and Jonathan and Yoni, this would not have happened. So I just want to thank all of you for your leadership, your participation, your knowledge, your brilliance, and looking forward to seeing you all again in 2 weeks. So thank you so much for joining, and hopefully those of you who are joining the game, let the Pats win if you're a Pats fan, and thanks again.
Thank you very much.